When you start to study and understand brain development or neuroplasticity or dopamine, I don't care if you're an atheist, agnostic, or believer in creator, you have to step back and just go, wow. The brain represents the apex of incredible in terms of biology. Like the heart is interesting, the immune system is interesting, the liver is interesting, but the brain is unbelievable.
I have to say the Christ-centered worldview and its relationship to neuroscience is one of my life fascinations, and apparently it's something neuroscientist Andrew Huberman has thought about as well. Now, this comes out in this interview we're about to watch. Huberman, if you don't know who he is an associate professor of neurobiology at Stanford University School of Medicine. He also has a very popular podcast about health, especially brain health. Now, in this clip, he does a great job of briefly giving tons of insight into the relationship between faith, neuroscience, and even prayer. Now, I'm Brett, in case you don't know me. I've been a pastor a really long time, and I can tell you from experience and education, this kind of material is helpful because it's biblical in ways that many of us as Christians overlook. Now, on the post side, I'm going to take his ideas and boil them down to three great principles that I think will help your faith and your prayer life and your relationship with God to thrive. And by the way, if you like this kind of conversation, please give us a like and subscribe here at One Life Network, and let's get to it. This is Andrew Huberman.
When you're talking about the brain and all the, I mean, you mentioned it last night, and this had me thinking. It's like, when you think how all that works, I have to take an aside and say, how could that happen in nature is without a creator?
Yeah. So, well, here's the thing. I mean, we know that the programs, meaning genes, so genes, DNA, and there's DNA, then there's RNA, and then there's proteins. And proteins are the action end of the game where they say, hey, like grow over here, don't grow over there, become this kind of cell, dopamine cell or a serotonin cell. We know that those mechanisms are incredibly well conserved from mice to humans. Now, certain things happen in the human brain that you don't see in other species, like the elaboration of the parts of the brain that are involved in context and planning, especially.
That was a nice little note he dropped there. It just kind of goes on, but that's one of the key differences between us and other animals.
But the memory systems, the ones that control hormones, breathing, heart rate, they're very similar. Not exactly the same, but very similar.
Okay.
When you start to study and understand brain development, as I did, or neuroplasticity, or dopamine, you have to, meaning I don't care if you're an atheist, agnostic, or believer in creator, you have to step back and just go, wow, wow. Now, then of course there's this difference among scientists as to who believes in God, who doesn't. I'll just go on record. I'm very comfortable saying it. I believe in God. I do. I think there are many things that science can explain. There are certain things science can't explain, but I'll even go a step further, which is that all the elements of science are entirely compatible with the idea of there being a God.
Huge statement right there. Keep your eye on that one.
I'm not the first scientist to say this. I mean, Einstein believed in God. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists ever, clearly believed in God. There are many atheist scientists. There are agnostic scientists who are just kind of like unsure, right? And, you know, for me, I'm in absolute awe of biology. It's just incredible that we're sitting here having this conversation. It's with language, that there are little sound waves that you're perceiving and understanding. I mean, it's just,
that's another huge point as well.
and I think the brain represents the apex of incredible in terms of biology. Like the heart is interesting, the immune system is interesting, the liver is interesting, but the brain is unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the number of different ways you can move your body compared to another species. Think about what you did today. Think about what I was attempting to do today, right?
Yeah.
Spectacular. Think about technology, these lights, the, Tesla cars, spaceships. I mean,
Yeah.
the internet, I mean, unbelievable. And yet, oh, so real.
Yeah.
So, we could talk a bit about how well, I'll just say this. Secretly, I've always prayed. I grew up in a split religion home. My family's like the UN. We've got people from Guatemala, Denmark, Argentina, New York, like all the different political battles are in my family. Super left, super right, libertarians, lefties to the, it's crazy. Thanksgivings can be difficult.
Yeah.
But I'll say this, I absolutely pray. I absolutely love that the idea, but also what for me is really a deep belief, which is that we can't control everything. We're not in as much control as we think we are. And that the magnificence of biology and the magnificence of nature is, it's impossible for me to conceive how that could come about any other way. It just is. Now, yeah, I mean, I think that, full stop.
Who do you pray to?
It's an interesting one because I think God. Yeah. So I absolutely do. I've actually started reading the Bible recently, start to finish. I feel like it's my duty to learn and in some sense compare Old and New Testament. I'm really interested in the stories, but I'm fascinated by the story of us, right? And the story of everything. And so, but yeah, I pray out loud in the morning, sometimes again in the middle of the night if I wake up. And it's only recently that I've been doing this more often.
It's giving you peace? Or?
Oh, my goodness. It's given me so much. It's given me peace. And, this is going to sound weird and probably people are going to be like, what are you talking about? If this, it works. It works. There's a way in which certain things I was grappling with, I just couldn't resolve. I couldn't do it. And it was all internal and I just couldn't do it.
How were you trying to resolve these things? Like have an answer?
Yeah, discipline myself. I mean, it wasn't like I was super, undisciplined. I mean, obviously I have a lot of self-discipline, but
yeah,
I always pray, I want to remove my defects of character. I always wanted to have a deeper relationship to God. I always wanted that. And I kind of was like, why don't I have that? Well, duh. That's like saying, I want to be fit. Why I'm not fit? Well, because you're not running, you're not lifting, you're not doing the things. It was like, and it was a couple of different people that kept showing up in my life and they were doing it. And it was like, well, pray. And, I've learned, and I certainly try and do this, that a lot of prayer is about listening. And a lot of prayer is about you ask for things or listen for things. And then an hour later, 2 days later, you go, wait, like it doesn't happen in the moment necessarily, just like fitness. I don't want to compare fitness. I don't want to trivialize prayer by comparing to fitness, but there's some parallels that are relevant. Yeah.
It's consistent work.
Yeah. It's consistent work. And then all of a sudden, like things come up and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe it.
There's a lot of that answer is obviously ad hoc, and he's asked a very good question. First of all, just about, how can this just happen? But I love the fact that he goes from the larger question about creation and the philosophy behind it, and then all the way down to prayer. And that's what I want to do as well, just to kind of lock some things down, because I think you could take this kind of stuff and really enrich your faith or your potential for faith in some key ways. And the first thing, he said it this way, he said, all the elements of science are entirely compatible with belief in God. And that's something that if you and I will get through our heads, our life will be a lot better, because it is a myth that they're not compatible with belief in God. That science and rationality and all these things are not separate from that. And we've been trained in the modern world to think that way. It's the spiritual over here, the irrational over here, and then the science and the rational over here. And according to the Bible, that's not true. And we even do that to ourselves as Christians. We often think, well, Christians are into the spiritual thing, and science, that's just kind of natural stuff. And according to the Bible, it's the God who is spirit who made all the natural stuff. And that's why you can get so much out of studying neuroscience and all the things. Now, he gives the evidence of Einstein and Carl Jung. I could give the evidence of where science came from. It came from Western Europe, a very Christianized culture, and it came from the likes of Isaac Newton, who believed in God, Johannes Kepler, Francis Bacon, who is considered the father of the scientific method. You read his writings, and he talks about God. It wasn't separate, and it doesn't have to be separate at all. They're not that way. And that leads to the second thing he said. He talked about how he was fascinated by biology and was fascinated by communication. And I would say this, that remember the Bible could be boiled down this way. A Christ-centered worldview grounds physical reality in the concept of meaningful communication. He was talking about communication, and that is one of the fascinations. How does that work? We can transfer ideas, my ideas to yours, yours back to me, and that's how technology works. That's how life works. But that is like this miracle. But what's interesting is the Christ-centered worldview would boil down reality to that. It all can be boiled down to meaningful communication. You could go so far as to say that Jesus' identity is talked about in the Bible as being the message of God. And that leads to the final thing, because their conversation goes over into prayer. It's not just about science versus religion or something like that. It gets into how prayer functions. And he's talking as a neuroscientist, and he says this works. Well, why does it work? Well, first of all, because we're designed that way. We're hardwired for communication. The entire universe is a communication system. All the way down to DNA is language, and out in physics is math. It's all communication, and it's the message of God. And if you want your relationship to God, that's why this is so important, that the way to get there is to interact with God's words, which are the Bible. And I respect the fact, and I don't know if he's a Christian or not, he was exploring or whatever, but he says, I feel an obligation to get in there and read the Bible from cover to cover, compare what's being said. But there are studies that have been done of people who draw close to God. It involves two fundamental things. It is reading the Bible, listening, like he said, listening, but then interacting with that, and that's what actually gets you to a place of this working prayer that you can sense is actually moving you into places of peace and depth and all that. Now, if you're a beginner at that, or if you've always been frustrated with that, we have a video that just kind of boils it all down and says, listen, if you ever feel stupid reading the Bible, you don't know exactly what to do with all that, it helps with those things, give you some principles there. Hope all that helps. See you next time.